my name is Steffen Rimner. I'm an assistant professor in the School of History at University College Dublin in Ireland and also director of the UCD Centre for Asia-Pacific Research. And I'd like to thank especially Tara Byrne at the UCD Institute for Discovery for giving me this opportunity. And I do hope that everyone who is listening and watching will learn something from this brief introduction to my research, teaching, and other activities. What really started in my early college years as a fascination with East Asia, especially with the foreign relations of China and Japan in the late 19th and early 20th century, was essentially driven by an interest in humanity. To be more specific, I think I was interested back then whether there isn't a much wider range of human sentiments and lifestyles and mentalities than I was accustomed to, having grown up and been educated in Germany. And I felt that especially in college, where I had the great privilege of being taught by some marvelous professors, that in some ways we were lagging behind in our knowledge and in our understanding of East Asia, both past and present. And since those days, I think that passion has never quite disappeared. In fact, traveling to East Asia myself, both as a student and later as a researcher, reaffirmed my commitment to this particular region of the world. And every single encounter that I've had with new friends and colleagues in East Asia has basically convinced me that the diversity of humanity is something to be treasured, something to be explored, and something that can become an endless source of fascination to any one of us. The past doesn't rest. It doesn't quite leave us alone. It may be a common misconception both in parts of academia that are not firmly committed to the humanities and the social sciences, and also outside of academia, that history is only about the past. I think there are many good reasons which researchers and others have explored and talked about for many generations now. There are many reasons why history is about much more than the past. And perhaps the most dramatic example that I could cite is that whenever a big international shock happens in our own time, whether that shock emanates from Asia or from another part of the world and affects Asia, we're usually surprised because we can't explain it very well. So the very nature of a shock means that we don't know exactly where it's coming from. We don't know what the background is. We don't know how it emerged, why it emerged, who drove it, who provoked it, and what it has to do with us. And the study of the past, therefore, gives us a unique opportunity to prepare for crises and shocks and other international experiences before they actually happen. Now, we are of course lucky if they don't happen, but in any case, the study of the past, and especially the study of the East Asian past, I think is fundamentally a useful activity and a very useful way to spend your time, whether you're a student or whether you're a professional. I think the reason why we can learn so much from other cultures is because oftentimes they relate to us. Especially in the past years when I was fortunate to reconnect with many junior and senior colleagues and some students in East Asian countries, I became very aware that the way that the education systems are set up and the way that even history as the subject of my specialization is taught oftentimes means that not everyone in East Asia, but many people in East Asia tend to know a little bit more about us, about Europe, than we know about them. And that means that there's an imbalance of understanding, which I think we should try to correct. And the best way to correct this is, of course, to immerse ourselves in the languages, in the cultures, in the past experiences, in the national experiences, in the personal experiences, the perceptions, in the worldviews, and much else of countries like China and Japan and their neighbors, whether you include Korea or Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, whether you include South Asia, whether you think of the Indian giant that is frequently cited in journalism these days. There are many, many reasons to tap into their experiences as much as tapping into our own. Now, this is not to say that our own national experience, whether in Ireland or elsewhere, does not matter or that we shouldn't study it. Of course, we should study it, and most of my colleagues have shown what the value is of studying Ireland's past. But at the same time, it does help to relativize our own experience and to make it look less absolute and less universal when we learn to look at ourselves from outside. In East Asia, of course, you have the same issue with national history as the predominant way of thinking. In fact, when national history first entered school curricula in most countries around the world, it was for the purpose of creating loyalty amongst the citizens of a new nation state. So the reason why we study national history is quite explicitly that people should learn about their own past, about the past of their own national community in order to defend and be proud of their national identities. But as we also know, in a world that is now globally interconnected, quite regardless of borders and boundaries and even continents, we do have a lot in common even when we don't know it. And at the most basic human level, when you actually travel to East Asia, when you live there, when you study there, when you pursue research, especially on East Asian societies and states, you realize that on a very fundamental level, there may be less difference than the cliches and the prejudices tend to tell us. The cliches, of course, always highlight the differences. They highlight the strangeness of other countries. They emphasize that somehow the fascination with those countries only exists because of the immense difference between them and us. But the more you get to know them and the more you're willing to approach them or even learn from them, the more you realize that we are all part of humanity in a very significant and deep sense. And that is the reason why I think we can learn from each other and why intercultural exchange is something worth pursuing. Well, what those experiences have taught me, I think, first and foremost, is that in almost every place where I studied and worked, I was lucky to meet so many great people. And it is one of the many correctives, I think, that is revealing a basic truth around the world, which is don't just rely on any stories that you hear about a foreign country. Try to go there yourself, talk to the people, and try to find out what you have in common with them. When you go, make sure that you don't just tell stories about yourself and about your home country, but that you also listen very carefully. The more you listen, the more likely you are to empathize. And this is something that directly flows into the way we pursue research in global history and in Asian history as well. And one example that I can mention here is the first book that I wrote, which is called Opium's Long Shadow: From Asian Revolt to Global Drug Control. It doesn't seem to be an issue that people are necessarily thinking about over the breakfast table every day. But the main thread in that narrative, in that first book, Opium's Long Shadow, is that sentiments of protest and opposition in Asian societies were communicated to societies in Europe and in North America quite effectively with severe political consequences, so that the era of the Opium Wars, which meant that European governments were by treaty entitled to sponsor drug trafficking in most parts of Asia, that these political privileges of empires were rolled back and turned around. The opium trade was abolished because of Atlantic societies, Western societies, getting convinced by Asian societies that something was fundamentally wrong with the practice of a government-sponsored drug trade that spanned the world. And so this is just one case study which shows how the global interconnectedness and the interdependence, which is visible in many other areas of today's world, can be traced through history, especially when you go through multiple archives and sources written in multiple languages. And this is something that you can learn when you have the opportunity to study in many different countries. So I encourage everyone who's still studying, who's embarking on their research careers, I encourage them to try to do the same whenever possible and visit the foreign countries that you study and try not to be an armchair academic like back in the 18th or 19th century. Well, first I should say that I'm very grateful to UCD for their support of the UCD Centre for Asia-Pacific Research, and also to my colleagues at the Centre who are working on far more interesting topics than I do, including Southeast Asia and disciplines like geography and anthropology and political science. And it's really thanks to them that I'm hopeful about the current and future work of the Centre for Asia-Pacific Research. I think the fact that UCD supported the setting up of this fairly young center itself shows how much Ireland and Asia have to do with each other. The importance of Asia, I think, is beyond question, it's beyond doubt. It's very important for Ireland as a member state of the European Union to build up a knowledge base and platforms for knowledge exchange with East Asian academic communities in order to prepare for the future that is now changing so rapidly before our eyes. This is not just an empty phrase. The necessity for Europe to engage more proactively in understanding East Asia in particular has a lot to do with global stability, with political stability as well as with economic stability. And the necessity to catch up, I think, is particularly visible when you compare the performance of not all European systems of higher education, but many of them, for instance, with the American system of higher education so far. I'm not saying that the United States has been the champion of Asian studies, broadly speaking, just because they're geniuses. But I do think that there's a very strong case that they got to a position in large parts of the 20th century. They got to a position of academic preeminence through knowledge exchange with East Asian partners. And the same applies still today. If you want to understand East Asia, you have to invite people from East Asia. You have to engage in serious, sustained and comprehensive discussions on all relevant topics with them. It's not possible any longer to understand East Asia by just having discussions amongst ourselves. And the good news is that the colleagues in East Asia, they're all too happy to tell us how they see things. It's worth remembering that many of the challenges that we read about in the headlines are not always by definition directed at Ireland or directed at Europe. Most of the foreign relations, when they undergo significant change, are directed at the immediate neighbors in the region. And so taking a regional approach, as the UCD Centre for Asia-Pacific Research does, reflects that reality. And we would be grateful to have your support in the years to come.